this series because we got 3 weeks left, including today, and then we take a break for summer. Part of that break for this summer will be because we're renovating this space, and so we'll be on Sunday mornings. We'll be meeting at the middle school from I think June 9th until about middle of July, Lord willing. So hopefully this room will be renovated. So that's something you can pray about. So if not, we can blame somebody, but don't blame me. If you have your text, go ahead and turn to Ecclesiastes. And if you were with us last week or you watched online, then you know we didn't get through chapter 7. So the goal today is to get through chapter 7 and through chapter 8, and then we will try to get through chapter 9 and 10 the next week, and then 11 and 12 will get us to the end of Ecclesiastes as we have looked at how a king would pursue finding purpose for his life. So let's start off with chapter 7. We'll pick up at verse 23 because we talked about, lastly, not taking to heart everything that people say about you. And the reason you shouldn't take to heart everything people say about you is because you know what you've said about other people behind their back. So it's always wise to keep that in mind. So verse 23 and 24 says, "All this I've tested by wisdom. I said, I will be wise, but it was far from me. That which has been is far off and deep, very deep, and who can find it out?" So what we discover is that wisdom is partial, not total. And what I mean by that is, so if God grants you wisdom, you don't have total wisdom, but you can have partial wisdom, and you can be classified as being wise. So we would say about Solomon that he is wise, but he is not completely wise, although he was wise about many things, and Solomon also made mistakes. And so humanity and wisdom that we might have will be limited. And so Solomon's saying is, I wanted to be a wise guy, so I asked God for that. God gave him that. And so one of the things that he discovered, and I would say even I think I had this discovery too, is that he wanted to be wise. He discovered that he would not be totally wise. When I was younger, going into college, I knew that God had called me to be a pastor. So one of my goals was to go to school and learn how to answer all the questions. That was a foolish goal because it wasn't long after that that I got into studying theology, and I soon learned that I would not be able to answer everybody's questions. Now, I can answer a lot of people's questions today, but I don't have all wisdom. I have some wisdom. I don't always apply it, but I do have some wisdom, and so you keep growing in wisdom, and look, that growth in wisdom is going to continue for eternity. And I don't know if you ever thought about this. So we have this idea that when we die and go to heaven, that everything will be made clear, meaning we will know everything. But the truth of the matter is, when you get into heaven, you are not God, so that means that there's going to be time with God that you're still going to be learning from God. Now, you all things will be clear, you'll be without sin, and so you will have great clarity, but you won't know everything, but you will be learning from Jesus for eternity. That means there's a lot of stuff you don't know. And that means a lot of stuff I don't know. So we're going to grow in our wisdom, and so in a very real sense, we'll still be discipled when we are in heaven. Now, verse 25 through the rest of the chapter, let's read that. "I turn my heart to know and search out to seek wisdom and the scheme of things, and to know wickedness of folly and the foolishness that is madness. And I find something more bitter than death, the woman whose heart is snares and nets, and whose hands are fetters. He who pleases God escapes her, but the sinner is taken by her. Behold, this is what I found." So he had this experience. "The preacher, while adding one thing to another to find the scheme of thing, which my soul has sought repeatedly, but I have not found one. One man among 1,000 I found, but a woman among all those I have not found. See, this alone I found, that God made man upright, but they have sought out many schemes." So let's walk through this little section. So Solomon says, I've discovered something more bitter than death. So the question would say, what is that? Have you ever learned the hard way? Or y'all just all the people, like you were taught and you just learned it, and so you didn't need to learn the hard way. I know some of you well enough to know you've learned the hard way. You've experienced enough difficulty to teach you things. So basically what he says is basically with a promiscuous woman, that's more bitter than death. So let me say this. The point is not just that women are evil here. Like if somebody says, that's why Adam and Eve is short for evil. Like that's not like the context. So the context is just about people in your life, but in particular he gives an example. So this is like if you're doing a speech, you give an illustration that how he had been tempted in his life. So he got tempted by a woman, he got trapped by a woman, and that can happen to anybody. And sexuality can get you into trouble. And so he's saying you need to be careful with this, and that patience in sexuality is needed for better relationships. So Solomon's wisdom, when you look at his story, was short-circuited by the women in his path. In other words, he had a weakness for women, and that those women led him astray in his life. Now, that's just not my observation, but that's an observation that we get from the text of Scripture. So I want to get us to flip over to 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 1 through 6, and I'll read it to you. So here's what it says. Now, King Solomon loved many foreign women. So Solomon loved the ladies, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, a Moabite, an Ammonite, an Edomite, a Sidonian, and a Hittite women from the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the people of Israel, you shall not enter into marriage with them, neither shall they with you, for surely they will turn away your heart after the God. So that's actually from Deuteronomy chapter 17. And so Solomon clung to these in love. And he had 700 wives who were princesses and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and then his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as with the heart of David his father. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of Ammonites. So Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and did not wholly follow the Lord as David his father had done. So what we see is he's writing that there's something that's more bitter than death, and he says, you got to be careful in your relationships. And so being careful in the area of sex is important for all of us. He uses this phrase, he says, the one who escapes her, but the sinner is taken by her. So there's the person who escapes, and there's the person who's ensnared. So if you were to go back to Genesis, you really have like back-to-back stories about this very thing. So for time's sake, we won't do the whole story, but like if you know the story in Genesis chapter 38 is the story of Judah, how Judah was ensnared by his daughter-in-law when she posed as a prostitute on the side of the road. So long story short is Tamar trapped him because she had married one of his sons. He died. Then another son, Onan, wouldn't get her pregnant, and then he didn't want to give his last son to her so that she could have children and keep the family name going. So she posed as a prostitute on the side of the road, and the father-in-law came by and he had sex with her, but she asked for him to give her his cord. So he did, and then she got pregnant, and he was about to shame her, kick her out of the house, and then she's like, oh, by the way, I got this cord, right? And then like he knew. So he'd been ensnared. And so like I think like Solomon could be saying, this is why you have to be careful about sexuality. He thought he was going to get away from it, but he was ensnared. And then like the next chapter, you learn about like Joseph. And so what happens with Joseph? Joseph, long story short, his brothers hate him. They throw him into a pit. He gets sold into slavery, ends up at this guy named Potiphar's house. He's a servant there. Potiphar's wife starts digging on him and she's like, I want you to come to bed with me. And like, he's like, I can't do that. How could I do that and sin against God? And you know, your husband's giving me charge over everything. And so one day she's got him in the bedroom and she's trying to seduce him, and he gets scared and runs off, and she grabs his cloak, and then he ends up going to jail for a crime he didn't commit. But he escaped that temptation. Now, I say that to say, you know, we all have to pay attention to this, whether you're unmarried and single or where you're married. You need to pay attention that you don't fall into sexual sin. And so Solomon's writing about this temptation, and he warns about this. And so, you know, when I'm talking to, you know, young women about getting married, and I warn them and say, hey, you know, do not have sex with this guy until you get married, until he's willing to say before God and other people that he will protect and provide for you. You should not give yourself to him. And so that's an important thing, because you need to know that if you're going to give him your beauty, he's going to give you his strength. And so that's, you know, important for the relationship that you have. And all throughout the writing of Solomon, especially in Proverbs, he warns his own sons about the dangers of sex outside of marriage. And so when you go through Proverbs, he's always talking about, like, don't be an idiot. Don't be stupid. Don't be foolish. With that, if you go back to the story of Joseph, so when you read the text of Scripture and you talk about sexual sin, so how do you escape it? It's always run. It's always flee. Like, you don't hang around and think, I can do this and I won't give in to sin. So like all my years of teaching teenagers and working with college students, you know, this was a message that they need to hear loud and clear. Like, you cannot stay close to that and think you're going to overcome it. Like, if you think through the scriptures, like people who did succumb to sexual sin. So you had David, who was the most passionate guy for the Lord in all the scripture. He gave in. You have Samson, who was the strongest guy in all the Old Testament. He gave into that sin. You have Solomon, who's writing here, who had the greatest wisdom of anybody outside of Jesus, and he gave into this sin. So I would be talking to these young guys and say, so do you think you're better than David, Samson, and Solomon? Because I got to tell you, you're probably not. So don't think that you're the exception to the rule. So what is it you do? 1 Corinthians 6:18, flee from sexual immorality, run. And so I think this is what Solomon gets at in this section. And then he gets into this discovery that humanity is not right before God. He says there's one upright man in 1,000 and 0 women in 1,000. How's that said on everybody? So then you get to, so does he mean that literally? So let me tell you what I think this means. He says there's one righteous dude among 1,000 and no righteous dudettes. So what's he really saying? So he's not saying that there are not any righteous women, but he's saying he ain't found one. And he's using this in terms of hyperbole, so it's an exaggeration. To say finding someone who's upright before God, who's righteous before God, it's hard to find people like that. Like, if I were to ask you, instead of saying upright, it would say, how many people do you know, man, that they're really, truly sold out to Jesus? Like, that's what they're about Jesus. Like, you probably, if you're honest, would go, 1, 2, if it's hard to find that person. Now, hopefully at Grace Point, you'd be like, well, I can tell you a bunch of them at Grace Point. But if you remember the story in Genesis where God sends angels, he's going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham's nephew Lot is living there. And so Abraham starts bargaining with God. Well, before you destroy it, like, there are good people there. And so basically he says, I won't destroy it, God says, if you can find 50 people who are righteous. And Abraham goes looking, well, I can't find 50. So, what if I find 40? What if I find 30? What if I find 20? What if I find 10? And he can't find them. And so finding people who truly follow the Lord is hard to do. But this is a deliberate exaggeration, so women don't take this personal. What he's doing is emphasizing like a point. So, for example, do you know the story of David after David killed Goliath? They started singing that song that really got under Saul's skin. Do y'all know that song? So the song was basically like, if they on Israel radio, they would play it, or they'd be singing in the streets. So the song was, Saul's killed his thousands, but David's killed his 10,000s. Like David had not really killed 10,000 people, and I don't think Saul had like numbered up to 1,000. But what they were saying is David is greater than Saul. And when Saul heard that, like he went like kind of crazy, got really jealous, started trying to kill David. It's an exaggeration of the situation. If y'all don't know that story, you probably know the story from Dumb and Dumber when he meets with a girl and he says, well, like, what's my chance? And she says, 1 in a million. And like he's like, so you're saying there's a chance? Yeah, it's a slim chance. And so 1 in a million was an exaggeration. So y'all probably don't watch Dumb and Dumber, and some of you might not be that old. So, but the point being, as Solomon says, God made humanity upright, but man has not lived uprightly. And he says they've sought out schemes, many schemes. And so the problem is, see, this alone I found that God made man upright, but they have sought out many schemes. That's us. Like we have sought out many schemes. So we've fallen short. And so God has to deal with our problem. What is our problem? Is that we're sinners. We're not upright. Which leads to chapter 8. And he begins in to talk about who is like the wise, verse 1, and who knows the interpretation of a thing. A man's wisdom makes his face shine, and the hardness of his face is changed. One of the things, there's two things, let's say it this way. There's two things in life that are difficult to live with. One is authority, and the other is inequity. And we all struggle with living with authority and with inequity. Authority because our personal bent toward rebellion. So we have trouble with authority because we like to disobey. Inequity because of our general bent toward rebellion, which is everybody else's sin. Because that's what we struggle with inequity. So if I were to ask you as an adult, how hard is it for you to submit to somebody else's authority now? You don't have to say it out loud, but scale to 1 to 10, like 0 is I have no problem with anybody else's authority. 10, I have a lot of problem with people's authority. I bet most of us in the room, probably if we're honest, we have a lot more trouble with it than we think. Because I think sometimes as adults, we think the only people who have really a trouble with authority are teenagers. But we're just better at masking it. Have you ever thought about why it's hard to submit to other people? So like if you're a member at Grace Point, so I'm the pastor of the church. If I came to you under spiritual authority of being the pastor of the church and you're a member of our church and I ask you to do something, how would you respond to that? Especially if you didn't want to do it. I'm not coming to your house to do that probably, but if I did, I don't know that you would like me. You may leave Grace Point and go somewhere else. So we all have trouble, and I think sometimes that's because of pride. Sometimes it's because the people who are over us ask for what we deem as unreasonable things, or we feel like it's too hard or too much. It'd just be, in myself, I think I struggle with that just because I don't like to do what other people tell me to do, right? And so, like, I'll find myself arguing with somebody just for the sake of arguing with them. Not because I think I'm right, or I just like to argue sometimes. And so when we get to the question, and he says, hey, well, who is like the wise man? Who knows the explanation of things? Obviously that's God. Then he says, wisdom is a bright face and a soft appearance. So the bright and shining face is a face that is happy, not sad. So when you see somebody and they're happy, what do you say? Like, they're beaming. Like, They were just beaming with joy, like, because their face shows it. That's why, like, I don't know if you ever thought about it. Like, when you read it like this, it sounds kind of weird. But when you text people, you use emojis. Because before we had emojis, do you remember, like, what texting was like before we had emojis? You didn't get any sort of emotion. And, like, you're like, what do they mean by that? Were they joking? Or, like, so you're trying to read the text. And that's what, like, the emoji helps with, because it gives you the bright face, or it gives you the sad face, or, so then you see it. So in the book of Nehemiah, you get the story of Nehemiah gets a report of basically the desolation of the gates around Jerusalem and how things are not good there. And his job, he's the cupbearer to the king. And so, like, he gets really sad-faced about this. He's, like, really down. And one of the things, if you go back and look at history, if you were the cupbearer to the king, it was a requirement that whenever you appeared before the king, that you always appeared with a beaming face. Like, you were not to go in front of the king with a sad face. And he does, because he's so burdened by what he hears about Jerusalem. He goes in, and so the king asks him this very question, like, why is this hardness of your face? Why do you have this demeanor before you? And so, like, you recognize it. That's why, like, when you talk to people on a regular basis, you can recognize what's going on the inside by what's on the outside. When your kid doesn't get their way, what do? They poke out their lips? Or your husband? I'm just kidding. So like, what a soft appearance is and a hard appearance is. Someone who's mad and angry, they have a certain look to them. So we pay attention to how somebody looks. And so he says, a man's wisdom makes his face glow. The hardness of his face is changed. So in other words, if you become wise, in which we've talked about this, and reiterate it, wise is not just knowing, it's what? Knowing plus doing. So the wise person is going to live with a beaming face and with joy. The foolish person is not going to have that. They're going to have the hard face. They're going to have angry face, sad face. So it's important that we learn this. And then he says, I say, keep the king's command, which we would say, surely you would, because you're Solomon, you're the king. But he says, keep the king's command because of God's oath to him. So he's saying, don't just keep the king's command, but because he says so, but you keep the king's command because he has been put there by God and he has made a vow to God. That's why you keep his oath. So then we'll jump to verse 3 in a second. So, like, he's saying live under the king's authority. And so it's vital that we learn to live under authority. Now, this coming Sunday, when we talk about kids, we're going to talk about discipline, and we're going to talk about disciplining your kids. We're going to talk about teaching your kids to live under authority so that they, when they are in authority, they know how to be in authority, because you learn best how to be in authority by being under authority. So if you want to be over, you need to learn to be under. If you were to say to me, like, if I ever write a book on leadership, it would be about this. If you want to know how to be a great leader, learn to be a great follower, because the greatest follower is the greatest leader. Because the greatest follower who's ever lived is Jesus Christ. He was perfectly obedient in everything he did, and that's why he's the candidate to be the greatest leader. And so if I want to teach my kids to be great leaders, then I got to help them learn to be great followers. And that's the process. And so that's what we're going to. So to keep the king's command says obey your authorities. Now, for Solomon to say it, it sounds a little self-serving. But remember, the Holy Spirit is moving him to write this. So what do we learn from this? We notice, like, we have to live under authority. And living under authority, for a lot of us, can be a very complex thing and not always simple, because our earthly authorities are not always perfect and don't ask us to always do the right things. And so you say, well, I live in America. I don't live under a king. Well, you live under authority. Everybody lives under authority. we don't call him a king. We might call it a president, or maybe it's the owner of your business, or maybe it's your coach, or maybe it's your teacher. You have authority. Matter of fact, we had this, I was talking to Kay about this because she's newly married, she's young, and she's getting out on her own. They just, moving their first rental house and this sort of thing. And she was talking about all the stuff you have to do now that you're an adult. Like, we all know that, right? So when you're a teenager, you think in your mind, I can't wait to get out of this house, and I'll have to be under your authority. And then so when I was working with students, I was just telling them, like, let me assure you of something. When you get out of this house, this house, you got one authority, and I'm including mom and dad together, one flesh. When you get out of this house, you're going to have a lot more authorities. It's a myth that you're going to get out and be under less people. You're going to have more people over you, all the way through the government and everything else. So, kind of shut that down. In a lot of the younger people that are in that age range, or like the 20s, they'll tell you, man, it was a lot easier back then because you grow in how many authorities you have in your life. So he says, why should you obey? Because he's made an oath with God. Specifically, he's referring to the Israelites in this. If you go back to Deuteronomy 17, for time's sake, we won't read all of this. Let's go read it. So let's read what the king's supposed to do. Pretty interesting. So this will be chapter 17. This is the one that just was, we're talking about not supposed to marry women who are not basically Israelites. So here's what he says. Laws concerning Israel's king. When you come to the land that the Lord your God has given you, and you possess it and dwell in it, then I will set a king over me. And don't say, then you say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me. And that's what they did, by the way. So you may indeed set a king over you, whom the Lord your God will choose. So you don't get to choose your king. One from among your brothers shall set a king over you, and you may not put a foreigner over you who is not your brother. Only he must not acquire many horses for himself, or cause people to return to Egypt in order they may acquire horses, since the Lord has said to you, you shall never return that way again. And he shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, which is what Solomon did. Nor shall he acquire for himself excessive silver and gold. And then he, continues to talk about what you should do if you're the king. So when the Israelites got to the promised land, what did they do? They eventually said, we don't want you as God. We want an earthly king like all the other nations. And so God said, I'll give you that, but you're going to regret that choice, because you're going to get this earthly king, and he's going to deal with you harshly. He's going to tax you. He's going to take your land. He's going to take your sons and put them in his army, and they're going to go to war and die. And so he says, it'd be better if you didn't do this. And they said, we're good with that. So they sacrificed, and they made a deal with God. And this is, I think, what Solomon is referring to with the oath. And they wanted to be like everybody else, which is a great, if you ever want to talk to your kids about, hey, you don't want to be like everybody else. That's what they did. And they suffered for that choice. Generally speaking, about authorities, we as Christians, in particular, I think in America, because we're so individualistic and we want to talk about our independence all the time. When Paul writes in Romans 13 that every authority has been established by God, that God puts everybody in authority. And so if you are to rebel against that authority, you're actually rebelling against God. And, which anytime you talk about that, the immediate response is, well, what about this? And what about that? And so when you learn that every authority is established by God, that means the good ones and the bad ones. So the kings of Israel, when the country split and you had the northern kingdom, the southern kingdom, so you had Judah and Israel, there were a lot of bad kings. A matter of fact, the northern kingdom, that's all it was bad kings. but you were to submit yourself to the king. And so let me belabor this because he goes into this. He says, be not hasty to go from his presence. Do not take your stand in evil cause, for he does whatever is pleases. For the word of the king is supreme, and who may say to him, what are you doing? Whoever keeps a command will know no evil thing. The wise heart will know proper time and the just way. And he says, for there is a time and a way for everything, although man's trouble lies heavy on him. For he does not know what it is to be, for who can tell him how it will be? No man has the power to retain the spirit or power over the day of death. There is no discharge for war, no wickedness will deliver those who are given to it. All this I observe while I apply my heart to all that is done under the sun, when a man had power over a man to hurt it to his hurt. So be not hasty before his presence. So we shouldn't be quick to get out of the presence of our authorities. What we should be is patient with them. Why? Because being in charge is hard. If you're in charge of people, you'll know this is true. Being the leader ain't always fun. It's difficult. It's frustrating. Who would like to be, I want you to raise your hand, if you would like to be the President of the United States today? I see those hands, like we don't even want to do it anymore. Like, they used to be dreams of kids, right? Be the President of the United States. But we're like, I don't think I want to deal with these people because it's hard. Running a business is hard. Coaching a team's hard. Pastoring a church is hard. And so, one way you know it's hard, you ever notice this? You ever notice our presidents when they go in office, the way they looked, and then when they get out, man, they look rough. I mean, they look haggard. I mean, because it's like nonstop. And so, it's hard on a person to leave. And so, they go through those phases in authority as well. And so, sometimes you think, oh, well, we know better than they do. But it's a hard job. And so we need to give them a little grace. And so, you ever notice this with your children? This is kind of the phase of children too, right? So don't be hasty. I'll go back. Where's the passage again? Let me read it again. So, be not hasty to go from the presence of your authorities. Let's read it that way. Do not, so when your kid is young, they love to be in your presence. So they stay with you because they're patient and trusting with you. But when they get to be a teenager, what do? They don't like to be in your presence. They try to get out of the way because you've gone from being a genius to an idiot in a few years. I remember so I grew up in Macon, so we used to go to the Macon Mall. Anybody ever go to the Macon Mall? It's a shell of what it used to be, but so we would go there. I would go with my parents, and they would drive me there and give me money to do everything I needed to do, but I didn't want to be seen with them. I wanted to benefit from them, but I didn't want to be seen from them because I was hasty to get out of their presence. And then eventually the good news is they become an adult, and then they realize you're not an idiot after all, and then they come back. So what should we say about this? So enjoy the company of your authority. It may say something about our hearts if we're in a hurry to get away from them, the people who oversee us. So here's something to consider. I just thought about this when I was working on this. If a person can't stay in a job for very long, I think maybe a lot of times it's an authority issue. They have a hard time following. So here's the application. If you have a hard time following, ask yourself, why am I having a hard time following? And how you fill in that blank is often them. But I want you to think about it. Maybe the problem is not them, maybe it's you. And that, I think, is important for all of us. If you go to the book of Daniel, I love the book of Daniel for this type of thing. Because Daniel had to live with pagan kings. He had to live with men, kings who did not love the Lord. He had Nebuchadnezzar. He had Darius. And so, you know the story, like, the very beginning, like, Daniel's like, I can't eat this stuff. And so he had to kind of work through that. And then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? The Nebuchadnezzar, he got like bad consultation to build a statue of himself and make everybody, the band's going to play, y'all bow down. And they didn't bow. And if you don't bow down, we're going to throw you in the fiery furnace. And so, like, that's a rough leader. Like, that's a tough situation. And so Daniel had to live with that. And then, you know, David had to live with Saul. Saul was trying to kill him all the time, throwing spears at him, hunting him down. He's like the fugitive. Like, they're after him all the time. And so, the verse gets here and he says, don't take your stand in an evil cause, for he does whatever he pleases. So two things there, like, don't join in rebellion against your authorities. You're responsible for what you do. And we should always be slow to rebel against our authorities. Do not join in rebellion with your authorities either, because you're not responsible for what they do. So the boss can do what he pleases. That's why he says, for the word of the king is supreme, and who may say to him, what are you doing? Like, you ever heard the phrase, it's good to be the king? Because the king gets to do what he wants to do. Like, the king can often, the rules don't apply to him. And so, if that's the case, like, we want to be careful that we don't do evil because the king's doing it. Because his words are supreme, and who's got the right to question him? And the answer is no one. We're just used to democracy. So, like, all of us, we're used to the republic that we live in. But, in Solomon's day, in David's day, like, for you to question the king may be the last question you ask, because they could take your head off. And so nobody, they felt like nobody had the right to tell them what to do. So don't join in with the kings and doing evil. So one of the things I would say about this is everybody has a governing authority, even the king. So if I ask you, so who is going to hold the king accountable? God. That's whose authority. Everybody is under authority. So if you have a manager, he has a boss. If you have a coach, he has an athletic director. If you have a teacher, she has a principal. All of them, at the end of the day, are under the authority of God. And so, so you go, so what should you do? Whoever keeps a command will know no evil thing. The wise heart will know at the proper time and the just way. So do good, and you'll probably be fine. Keep the command, and you'll be good. If you don't, you may be punished. So then the question becomes, if I obey my authorities, will I get punished? General rule is no. If you go to 1 Peter, we'll flip over there real quick. 1 Peter addresses this in chapter 2, verses 13 and 15. So he says, be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution. So why do you submit to your authorities? For the Lord's sake, to make God look good. Not because they're good. Whether it be to the emperor as supreme, which, when Peter wrote, it was Nero, so he was like terrible. Or to the governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. So in other words, generally speaking, if you do good, you won't be dead. But then he goes, but if you're doing good and you get punished for it, that's to be commended. So if you're doing good, people pat you on the back, but you should be doing good. But if you do good and you get punished for it, that's a different issue. We can get persecuted for serving Jesus. So if you're going to get punished, don't get punished for doing something you shouldn't be doing, but be punished for the spread of the gospel. That's what, might happen to some of us. So if you say, okay, what's Solomon saying? It says the wise heart will have discernment. You'll know the right time for doing the right thing, and you'll know the right way for doing the right thing as well. So give you an example of that. So in 1 Samuel chapter 24, we were talking about David had an unjust ruler, Saul. David already been anointed king. He knew he'd be the king, and so he knew that God was going to replace Saul with him. So if you remember the story, so David Saul's trying to kill him. He's got his army tracking him down. He goes into the cave. And so David and his dudes are hiding in the back of the cave. And then Solomon's army comes up to the mouth of the cave, and Solomon's like, I got to go to the bathroom. And I'm like paraphrasing, but this is what happened. So I got to go to the bathroom. So he goes into the cave to relieve himself. And when he's in the cave doing his business in there, like David's guys are like, dude, like God's delivered him in your hands. He didn't know you're in here. Like you just need to sneak up and, off with his head. And so, and David like rebukes him. He's like, God has not given me the authority to put myself in this place. In other words, David's like, God is the one who's going to make me king. If I go kill Saul, I make myself the king. And so David didn't kill him. He had every chance. I mean, like, let's just be honest. We're in the cave and we're with David's guys. We're like, dude, like God's giving you the greatest opportunity. Go ahead and take him out. He's going to kill you if you don't kill him. But David sneaks off and cuts off the, I think it's called the tzitzit of his robe. And then Saul goes out after he uses the bathroom, and then David comes out with it, and then Saul is repentant at that moment. Like he still gets mad at David later, but at that moment he's like, man, David, you're greater than I am. And they have a love fest, and they go back, and then Saul gets back in his jealousy. But David trusted God in the moment. Just like Jesus trusted God, the Father, in the moment with Pilate and the Sanhedrin. So, verse 6, it gives more instruction, for there's a time for these things. And so, there's a time and a way for everything, and it will weigh heavily on you. So, what do I do, when I'm in these difficult situations? So, let me give you, three things that you can kind of think through, like a rule of thumb. So, when you have authority that's difficult to deal with, your relationship to them. So the number one thing you should do is obey them. Right? You should do what they ask you to do. This is the usual course of action. If you cannot do what they do because they ask you to do something that goes against what God would have you do, then what do you do? And for most of us, that won't be the case very much. But you may have a case where you're like Daniel and you have to eat food that you shouldn't feel like you should eat because it's against the law, or like with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you may be in that situation. So what do you do? So what Daniel did, so he didn't go from, okay, I'm going to obey, and then you ask me to do something, I'm going to rebel. There's another step in. So that's really your three choices. It's obey, appeal, and rebel. So what do you do? So if I've been asked to do something that goes against God's law, so what should I do? I should appeal to the authority. I should go. So remember the story with David? Daniel got really creative, and he went to the chief eunuch and said, hey, this diet that y'all got us on, it's the king's diet, but it goes against the Jewish law. Could we do an experiment where I just eat this and you watch me, and if I'm healthy, I can stay on this diet? That's a creative way to do it. He found another option. So he appealed to it, and look, and the chief eunuch told him, look, I'm gonna let you do this, but if you look malnourished and you're not doing well, I'm not gonna lose my job. I'm gonna lose my life. And so, that was a way that Daniel could show him, hey, let's do it for 10 days. Let's do it for 2 weeks. Let's do this experiment. But he appealed to me and found another option. So it's not okay, I'm obeying, but when you ask me to do something else, I just jump all the way to rebel. Because we want to rebel by our nature. And so I would say put another step in there, put the appeal in there, and trust God to show you another way. It's a great way because Daniel didn't want to get off the kosher diet, but it worked out, and then Daniel moved right up the line. So I love the way it did. So let me say this about authority too. And if you're in authority, you'll I think resonate with this. So when you do appeal to your authority, do it privately, not publicly. So when Daniel did this, what he did, he went to him privately. He didn't do it in front of all the other people. And the reason you do that is because it puts a lot of pressure on the person in charge to make a public decision. And like the principle behind this that I was taught was um, loyalty publicly leads to leverage privately. So you want to make sure that you like keep that in mind. And so Daniel didn't like try to show him up. He didn't try to make him look bad, and then he got favor. As a matter of fact, if you go to the story of Nehemiah, very similar. Like he was before the king, and he was doing his best to serve the king. Right? He was obedient, and God gave him favor with the king, Artaxerxes. So if you have to rebel, and this is a step you might have to take, you do what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did, and they got thrown in the fire. Now God saved them. But you know, sometimes God don't save you. Not like from the fire. He always saves you with the resurrection and through salvation. But there are plenty of stories where people weren't saved. You know, give you examples. So you had Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They rebelled against the law because it was against God's law. God delivered them. Matter of fact, you get to the next story, like Darius and Daniel, like they made a law because they didn't like Daniel. Like if you pray in public or if you get caught praying, you get thrown in the lion's den. So like Darius really liked Daniel. He didn't want to do that. But Daniel broke the law and they threw him in, and then God tamed the lions and Daniel came out of that. But if you decide to rebel based on what is being asked of you is against the Lord, then you got to trust God with the consequences. And sometimes they may not be pleasant. And if you remember what Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego said to the king, we're not going to bow down, even if we perish. They were willing to accept the consequences for the rebellion. And you have to too. So I would caution you to be slow to get to that point. Why is this important? Because no one knows what's going to happen. That's what he says. He's like, no one knows what's going to go on. And so if you're frustrated by those in charge, keep that in mind. Nobody knows what's going to happen because we can't see the future. Men make watches, but God made time. And we can only manage what we do. So like if you think about like when somebody says time management, it's not really time management, it's task management within time. And so don't let their authority or your authority go to your head. So God's in control. We're not always in control. Now, that leads to sometimes we see injustice. So let me read the rest of the chapter, and we'll try to get through this in the next 14 minutes. So buckle up. Then I saw the wicked buried. They used to go in and out of the holy place and were praised in the city where they had done such things. This is also vanity. Because the sentence against an evil deed is not executed speedily, the heart of the children of man is fully set to do evil. Though a sinner does evil 100 times and prolongs his life, yet I know that it will be well with those who fear God, because they fear before him. But it will not be well with the wicked, neither will he prolong his days like a shadow, because he does not fear before God. There is a vanity that takes place on the earth, and there are righteous people to whom it happens according to the deeds of the wicked, and there are wicked people to whom it happens according to the deeds of the righteous. And I said, this is also a vanity. And I commend joy, for man has nothing better under the sun but to eat, drink, and be joyful, for this will go with him in his toil throughout the days of his life that God has given him under the sun. Remember, under the sun means without reverence for or reference to God. When I applied my heart to know wisdom, to see the business that is done on the earth, how neither day nor night do one's eyes see sleep, then I saw all the work of God, that a man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun. However, much a man may toil and seek, and he will not find it out. Even though a wise man claims to know, he cannot find it out. So injustice is frustrating. It can make you doubt the presence of God and the power of God and the love of God and the goodness of God. And sometimes the injustices you see are actually from the authorities who are above you, which is really a disturbing thing. And so the observation he makes at the beginning of verse 10 is, they will die and they will be buried. No matter how great they think they are, they're not going to live forever. Kings came and went, both good and evil. So you look at the history of the kings, you see both the good and evil both die. So verse 11 gets into how to live with life's inequities and that injustice. So we all want justice, but justice is not always served. So I want things to be fair, but it's not always fair. So why? Because evil will flourish when justice is not served. The children of men are the ones who don't have a relationship with God. And so we all look for fairness. And let's say this about being fair. Fairness isn't always justice. And fairness is also often overrated by us. Fairness means that everyone gets the same thing. Justice means the right thing is done. And so we often look in our culture as those as being the same thing, and so we desire fairness. And so there's a story that Jesus tells about this that, like, we don't like to hear people preach on. Y'all know this story? So Jesus tells a story about these guys. They get hired at 6 a.m. Y'all know this story? They get hired at 6 a.m. Boss says, I'm going to pay y'all this, a day's wage, denarii. Yeah, we're going to work. And about 9 a.m., he goes and gets another group. I'm going to pay y'all. And then about noon, he goes and gets another group. And then about 3 o'clock, he gets another group. And then about 5 o'clock, he gets another group, and then they get off of work at 6. So the boss says to his manager, he says, hey, look, pay these guys, and pay the guys who worked last first. So they go up, they've been working for an hour, man, they get a day's wage. They all lined up, right? They've been at labor finders. And they lined up, and then they get their pay. And so these guys are like, man, they got a day's wage. Like, that's what he told us we can get. So the next group gets a day's wage, and the next group gets a day's wage. And so the guys that got hired at 6 o'clock a.m., and so, put yourself in their shoes. What you going to feel about that? Potential spam's calling me. So if you got the same pay and you worked all day and they worked an hour, is that fair? Let's just be honest. Y'all be like vague booking about it, posting on Facebook how sorry they are. You know what Jesus says about the story? He says that the owner told him, well, why are you upset because I'm generous with other people? Like, that'll hit you pretty hard. Well, that's not fair. And then what he says to him is like, didn't I pay you what I agreed to pay you? We had a contract, and I paid you exactly what I told you I'd pay you. So what's your problem that I was generous with people who worked an hour? We don't like that story. But that's what he's getting at. Like, that's Jesus laying it down. That's tough. So I say that, say not everything we think is injustice is really injustice. We simply didn't get what we wanted. And that's when we usually call it unfair. And that's why, I love this passage. I don't always like applying it, but I like teaching it. The workers got what they agreed to. They got what they deserved. And they lost sight of the fact that the owner has the right to do what he wants to with his money. And so that's you and your kids, right? You got multiple kids, you'll hear that's not fair. So what he says too is talks about justice being delayed, and that when justice is delayed, you see an increase in wickedness. So, and I think that's part of what we're seeing in our country right now. Like, the wheels of justice move really slowly. And I think that's why one of the things, not the only reason, but I think we see a lot more wickedness in our country. Because whenever you have delayed justice, you're going to have an increase in evil because people think that they can get away with it. That justice will either be aborted, and so you can perpetuate injustice because it's not going to be dealt with. And that's why he says, wicked man does 100 crimes and he lives a long life. So we look at it and say, how can a person that has massive sins live a long life? That doesn't seem fair. Matter of fact, like in my vernacular, I say, man, that's kind of jacked up. How could God allow this? How could God be good? He must not exist. He must not care, or he must not have the power to do anything about it. So if you notice, like when I was reading it, Solomon never has that conclusion. That's not his conclusion for what God is doing in the world. He never says, well, because of that, God doesn't exist. Or because of that, God doesn't care about what happens to people. Or that God doesn't have the power to stop it. That's not his conclusion. So what Solomon says, in the long run, in the light of eternity, not temporarily, it will go better for the people who fear God. So in other words, does it matter if you fear God? And the answer is, from Solomon, yes. The wicked may temporarily have prosperity, but eventually they will have accountability. So it's better for you to fear God and do what's right than for you to think you're getting away with something, because you're not going to get away with it. So I would encourage you, if you have time, we don't have time than time we got allotted, but if you turn to Matthew chapter 13, 24 through 30, it's the parable of the weeds. So the tares grow up with the wheat. And so the parable is about the patience of God to let the weeds grow up so that he doesn't uproot the wheat. And so he waits for the harvest time when it's going to be separated. So that's why you have the talking of the throwing up the wheat so you get rid of the chaff. And so metaphorically, what Solomon's teaching, what Jesus was teaching, the parable is that it's a protection. So he says, if you notice, he talks about the shadow. Evening shadow is what Solomon has in mind. It lengthens as the day moves to the end. It has a sunset. But if you cut it short, you don't have peace. And quality is not good because you don't have peace. And so you're paying attention to God allows, the wicked to grow along with that, so he doesn't uproot what he's doing. So in other words, if you know God, then you'll fear God. And the first step of that is living wisely. So Solomon writes in Proverbs, the beginning of wisdom is the fear of God. So the starting point is there. So how do I know if I fear God? How do I know if I'm wise? If I fear God. So that's how you know. So verse 14, he goes into more about inequity and says, sometimes righteous men get what wicked men deserve, and sometimes wicked men get what righteous men deserve. And that's why you ask the question, why do good things happen to bad people and why do bad things happen to good people? There's, that happens in the world. And Solomon never explains why. He just says it is what it is. And so this, he says, is frustrating. But before he tells us what to do, he says, let's consider two unjust stories. I think he is alluding to these stories. If you want to know why do bad things happen to good people, there's an Old Testament story and there's a New Testament story that helps you to understand it. The first story is the story of Joseph. What his brothers did to him was awful. They threw him in a pit, sold him into slavery. And then 13 years later, God raised him up and put him in a place to save the known world. So what's the New Testament story? There's a man who walked the face of the earth, not just a man, but God in the flesh, who never sinned, and they put him on a cross because he claimed to be who he was, and they killed him. And what happened? It's our salvation. So when you look at the world and you see injustice and you don't understand it, the righteous get the wicked's punishment. That's what Jesus got. He died a criminal's death. But God is sovereign. When Joseph's brothers talked to him, they were like, oh, he's gonna kill us. What did he say to him? He said, but what you meant for evil, God meant for good. And isn't that the story of Jesus? What was meant for evil, God meant for good. If you were to ask and I ask this question of people all the time because they'll talk about, kind of coming to grips with evil in this whole predicament, is what is the worst thing that's ever happened in the history of the world? Do you know what people always say? They usually refer to the Holocaust and Hitler. Everybody who died in the Holocaust deserved to die because they were sinners. I'm not like, hey, we all deserve to die. The greatest evil in the history of the world is that Jesus died on a cross because he did not sin. And he died for sins that he did not commit. That's the greatest evil. And how did God use that? He used that so that you and I could be saved. So if you were like coming to grips with injustice, the one greatest injustice is that you had a righteous man die for unrighteous people. That is what God does. So real quickly we'll end because we got like a minute. So when you get to the verses 15 through 17. So what's Solomon's advice? Enjoy life. So when you go home tonight, get you some Oreos and some milk and dip it. Wise people have the joy of knowing, even when things are not good, that God is in control. And that God can take a bad Friday and turn it into a good Friday. So, God knows what's best. And we have to trust him in that. So God's powerful, and he's good, and he's wise. That's what you tell your kids when they say to you, well, that's not fair, right? What do you tell them? Yeah. But what are you saying to them? But I'm good, and I know what I'm talking about. Because you feel like you love them, and you feel like you have the power, and you know what's best for them. So what does God tell you when you say it's not fair? Trust me. Here's the second thing. So enjoy life, and I'll leave you with this. Don't waste your time trying to figure it all out. Did you catch what he said in the end? He will not find out. Even though wise man claims to know, he cannot find it out. So it's smoke. So don't spend all your days trying to figure it all out. The story of the Bible does not duck the hard issues of inequity in life. It actually highlights it and shows us how even though there is inequity in life, God will use it for your good. That's kind of crazy if you think about it. And that's why like a story of Joseph is so powerful, and obviously the story of Jesus. Do you really want to hear what would be fair and just? That you get to go to heaven because you don't deserve it. And so if you see that, so God used the greatest injustice for your salvation. So that's why I think Solomon says, enjoy life and stop trying to figure it all out. Fear God and just trust him. Because his plan is bigger than yours and it's better than yours. Let's pray. Father, thank you for your grace and mercy. There's stuff that's hard to come to grips with. I struggle with it because I'm trying to figure it all out. Like I'm trying to connect the dots, and my brothers and sisters who are watching online, join us here on site. We're all trying to figure it out. But let us just like get to a place where we just trust you. God, we know that you work all things for the good of those who love you. So we just want to love you and trust you. And when it don't make any sense and it seems really unfair, let us trust you. Let us dip the cookie in the milk in rest in your sovereignty. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.